Okay, today I want to talk more in detail about the rule of thirds. We briefly went over it in the last video, the 5 elements of composition. Today I want to dive just a little bit deeper about that because there is a misconception with new photographers that if they're not obeying this rule exactly, they don't have good photos. And that could not be further from the truth. The rule of thirds really shouldn't be called the rule of thirds. It should be the guideline of thirds or something about thirds, but not the rule of thirds. And so that really bothers me. So let's just review really quick. What is the rule of thirds? The rule of thirds says that we bring in grid lines from each side of the frame a third of the way in. And we should align the focus of our pictures on one of those third lines, and ideally the main focal point is lined up with those intersecting marks in each quadrant of the picture. Now, does every photo end up being that nicely laid out? No. And how does that align with, they call it God's thumb. It's another natural flow in the way things are laid out. And so things in your pictures don't have to obey this rule perfectly. So I want to talk about landscape photos and portrait photos and how they apply to the rule of thirds, how I use the rule of thirds when it comes to taking these types of pictures. First, let's get started looking at some landscape pictures. So I have this sunset right here. And now let's apply the rule of thirds to it really quick. Now with these grid lines on here, you can see that the horizon line is probably the only thing that lines up nicely with the rule of thirds. Now I do this with landscape photos if the sky is more interesting, and in this case I was trying to photograph the sky, the sunset, and so I moved the horizon line to the lower third. The ground, while it is interesting, does add some interest to the photo, which is really important. It's not everything, and so there's less importance, there's less space it takes up in that picture. Now, adversely, if the foreground or the ground was more interesting than the sky, because we have those cloudless days or those gray skies, right? Those are not as interesting as probably the ground, so I would move the horizon line to the upper third to captivate that a little bit differently. Sometimes, and probably newer photographers will put the horizon line right in the center. I had someone tell me one time that by putting the horizon line in the center, you're not giving importance to either the sky or the ground. And if one is more interesting, you should compensate for that. But at this point, I'm going to tell you it is purely your own aesthetic pleasure. You are the artist at this point. You don't have to listen to the rule of thirds. Okay. Now let's switch gears just a little bit and let's talk about portrait photography. Now here's this picture of bride and groom that you can see. Now let's put the grid lines on there. You can see that on purpose I did put the bride and groom on the third line because I wanted to balance out the building that's in the background. If I centered them from where I was standing, the building would kind of come out of their heads and their bodies, and those were not lines that I wanted surrounding them. And so by putting them off to the side or framing them off to the side, we could get that building to balance out just a little bit there. And so the rule of thirds for wider shots, I think the rule of thirds has a place for balance. But that doesn't mean that I couldn't have taken the same picture with them in the center, and I probably could have. I probably did for variety and options for the bride and groom to look at. But again, balance in your photos with everything going on is important, and it does kind of help lead you through as a viewer. But let's tilt that camera on its side and let's say we're doing a headshot like this one here. Typical headshot, however, a lot of photographers are going to typically put the center of that person's face in the center of the frame. And that is a no-go. That's one I will stand by. Okay. Now, when you put their face in the center of the picture, you're creating a lot of space around their heads. Okay, that's a lot of negative space. That is space that does not help them at all. And when it comes to doing headshots, they are the most important thing in that photo. Okay, so why give more attention to space, particularly around their heads, that has nothing to do with the shot? And if you're using that low f-stop to get that blurry background, the blurry background isn't going to do much for you. So unless it's a wider shot, we can talk about that. But for headshots, let's eliminate that negative space around their heads, zoom in, and now let's take a look at that same shot with the grid lines on it. Now, because of the way the rule of thirds is suggested, that we should have the eyes on that grid line and maybe one eye at the intersecting lines there, because that is one, portraits, when we look at people, we naturally look at eyes. Okay, so with the rule of thirds, we should be aligning these more important features. But at this picture, you can see that the eyes are a little bit higher than the third line. We're actually hitting more about the nose and the mouth area. And that's probably going to be typical of a headshot, is it's not going to line up with the rule of thirds at all. But we are somewhat close though if you think about it. Okay, by placing the model the way that I did here, their face is between those two intersecting quadrants, and their face is on the rule of third line, so it balances it out. It actually still works, and there's nothing wrong with this picture despite its imperfections against the rule of thirds. So when you're thinking about composition in your pictures, I want you to go back and just think of balance more than anything else. What is most important? What other elements are playing in the photo, whether it's a background or a foreground? How can you balance it out to kind of give a sense of the location you're at, but not draw away from the main focus of your picture, whether it's a person, a thing, whatever it might be. So your photo challenge for today is I want you to go through your pictures that you've already taken and see if they apply to the rule of thirds or not. Okay? And if you have subjects that are centered, try cropping them to be off center. Anything to just get a feel if this picture was composed differently, specifically composed to the rule of thirds, is it a better shot? Does it feel more pleasing to you as a viewer? If not, if you don't have any pictures or you're way beyond this, go out and try some new pictures. Okay? Not only do I want you to apply the rule of thirds as described to taking this new shot, but I want you to take a variety. Maybe try breaking the rule. Just get an idea of what works and create a style for yourself.